This is the Court Leader's Advantage, a podcast series for court professionals and by court professionals. Brought to you by thecourtleader.net and in cooperation with NACM, the National Association for Court Management. As court leaders, we are daily inundated with statistics and research. To deal with this flood, we have often been taught to have a healthy skepticism of statistics. We've been given advice that includes ask questions, go to the source of the research, and expose the assumptions behind the analysis. We've seen what happens when research is not properly evaluated. As a consequence, we're compelled to ensure that statistical analysis is objective and unbiased, valid and reliable, able to be replicated, and relevant to the work of your court. Having a healthy skepticism is all the more important in this day and age of misinformation. Most of us have heard that old joke that 73.6% of all statistics are made up on the spot. We don't want to be the one who is naively hooked by questionable statistical research. This advice is so easy to give, but just how do we hone our critical thinking skills? Imagine this common scenario. You're in a session with 500 attendees at a national conference. The presenter describes an exciting but controversial concept. At some point, that presenter voices the time-worn introduction. As studies have clearly shown. How do you, as a critical thinker, react? How do you overcome some of the very real logistical issues this scenario presents? For example, in the Q&A at the end of the session, you stand up and challenge the presenter to describe the statistical research that was referenced? Many find this kind of challenge awkward or possibly even rude. Do you simply assume that someone else in the audience will assess those studies and get back to you? Do you spend the time and effort to locate the studies and try to understand them? What if it's a topic that you're just curious about, but your court is not pursuing right now? Do you start to think that it might be just a drain on your work time? What if you actually locate the studies and spend time analyzing them? You end up with some legitimate questions. The sample size seems small. The program participants look like they may have been cherry-picked, or the consultants doing the evaluation are paid by the very program they're evaluating. Do you tell your judges? Do you tell your fellow court professionals in other courts? And how do you do that? Or do you just regress into becoming generally negative about all information and default into Mark Twain's popular adage that there are lies, damn lies, and statistics? I'm Pete Kiefer, and welcome to the Court Leader's Advantage podcast series. This month, we're looking at how we can remain critical thinkers about statistics without ending up just being cynical and jaded. Here to discuss this issue are Rick Pierce, Judicial Programs Administrator for the Pennsylvania Administrative Office of the Court; Cheryl Stone, Court Administrator for the Superior Court in Clark County, Washington; Greg Lambard, Trial Court Administrator for the Superior Court in Middlesex Vicinage, New Brunswick, New Jersey; Kent Pankey, Senior Planner for the Judicial Services Department for the Supreme Court of Virginia; and Liz Rambo, Trial Court Administrator for the Circuit Court in Lane County, Oregon. Thank you all for joining today's podcast. Tell me about a time when you were presented with some research or statistical information that you were skeptical of. Rick Pierce?
Yes, Peter, I do recall several instances in my time as a trial court administrator in Pennsylvania of data that was collected, not necessarily internally, but it was internally within the judicial system. It was collected by our AOC. And I think in many instances, the data was there to make one particular statement, but in a sense, it was interpreted broadly to say, okay, this court is more efficient than others. And I think that's done incorrectly because it's measuring one particular aspect of jury management it was in question here. And so I think then what happened in that instance is the media took it and ran with it. And I thought that was an inaccurate portrayal of where the courts were, in particular my court was. I think that the data that I collected internally, I had a lot of faith in but that's because I was the one that was actually looking or actually collecting the data and not going to any other source. And I think that was the thing that you had mentioned that always caused me pause for concern is the source. Whether if it was an outside source, I would think to question that readily.
Cheryl Stone.
I can think of a couple of times when statistics or the presentation of statistics seemed questionable. I can think of a specific time when we had a judicial officer manually tracking some statistics related to a therapeutic court. Those statistics did not match up with the case management data. And it turned out there was a lot of missing information from that data. The other example is I'm always skeptical when I see a data presentation that has an odd number of months or a strange reporting period without any context or no explanation. I think that it can be those types of things can be misleading and really go to the extent of trying to prove something you want to be true rather than taking the data for what it is.
Greg Lambard?
Yeah, I don't necessarily have a particular one. I know just that I'm always a little leery, as you said, if it's a consulting group that's been hired for, one side or the other of a particular project, because they're trying to maybe fill out an agenda or maybe not. But as someone who's trained in statistical research, always trying to figure out what the data set is that they were actually going against. And then, the boring stat class you may have had way back when where they were saying what's, the difference between descriptive and inferential statistics. Descriptive is just percentages and mean, median, all that. But the inferential, when you're trying to take a little bit of data and make a big inference out of it, that's where you need to really understand what the person's doing, what techniques they're using. The old correlation does not mean causation. I mean, these are things you may have heard, but they really truly are how you should look at data in order to be informed about what's, the person's trying to say. And that's when I get leery. If it's a small sample size, if the technique looks a little odd, if they decided they've had a ton of data, but they couldn't even be bothered to do a significance test, you kind of wonder really what they were trying to throw at you. I mean, it's tough in our profession because, obviously we're around a lot of lawyers. They're trained more on anecdotes than on statistics. And, that's often what they try to push. And we have to make sure that we're smart about listening, a smart consumer of information.
Ken Pankey?
Well, I see a lot of different statistical presentations that are good or bad, depending often on the underlying data sets. We're the Core Performance and Statistical Services unit of the Department of Judicial Services, and we see bad case data entry at the trial court level that then can distort assessments of how many judges and staff are needed. So we have to watch out there. But I'll talk more about strategic planning, which is my particular area. And we have to fight against a lot of resistance to change as it is. And when people are skeptical of strategic planning, they often will pull up the number that 67 to 70% of all strategic planning efforts fail. And that number gets bounced around in major publications, public sector and business. I find it in Inc. magazine and Harvard Business Review. And the underlying number has no basis in any kind of real research. It goes back to an interview about 30 years ago where some guy was ballparking a number in a specific field, and it's just been picked up and repeated without any background research to back it up. And it's very frustrating to me because it gets thrown in my face all the time.
Liz Rambo?
You were asking for specific examples, and I can't think of one, but I'll tell you what I do like, and it's what Greg was talking about. When I'm reading a publication or a study or a report or an evaluation, I like to see them refer to their statistical background. I like to see them refer to their sample size or the numbers that they're looking at or the courts that they surveyed or anything to give me an idea of whether or not they used any kind of scientific method to come up with what they're telling us. So those are the ones I particularly like to see.
Mm-hmm. Chip Heath, in his book, Made to Stick, wrote a very telling statement. He wrote, "One good story can level a mountain of statistics." Have you ever experienced a time when you had the data on a topic, but someone with a really good story proved to be more convincing? Liz Rambo?
How about every day of the week? I mean, we have the pleasure of dealing with, in the legislature, special interest groups, often who want the court to do a particular thing or another thing. And they will tell a narrative story. I had a couple of answers to this one, but the way you just asked it made me think of something very recent, as a matter of fact. So we are struggling in Oregon with a public defense crisis, a representation crisis. I would say we're calling it a crisis, but in Oregon, it's just starting. We're dealing with it at the get-go before it becomes really bad. And our defense consortium or the Defense Association has come up with stories to talk about what they want the courts to do. For example, they wanted our court to change how we do motion proceedings based on their story about what their defenders wanted in our county. And so I did the numbers, and these defenders had only asked for that thing 2 times in the last 2 years of the thousands of criminal cases that come through our court. Only twice. But the story is, and the story that's being told to our delegation is that they got us to do this thing that everybody wanted, when in fact, the statistics showed that it was never even in demand. Nobody wanted it. And so now our trial court rules have been changed and modified, and it's a pretty significant impact on our ability to manage judicial resources, because now the defense is no longer required to tell the court how long these proceedings are going to last. So you can just imagine. So yeah, that's the most recent one I can think of.
Rick Pierce?
Yes, Peter, I have several stories to tell. One very recently regarding our statistical compilation of security data that shows that there was violations, whether it's weapons brought into a court facility or not. And I think what we have a problem with is when we take this, whether it's to legislators or county officials or even other judicial officers, is the lack of context or the incorrect context in which it's used. They don't really have any means of comparing, okay, is that a very high number? Is that an outrageous number that we need to do something about and address? Or is that, okay, that's just common, let's just deal with it and we're not going to bother increasing our security? So that's one instance. And then the other instance that I was referring to earlier, back in my time as a trial court administrator, is how courts are relaying their information that's collected in a snapshot. And there's one particular measurement that we use for in Pennsylvania, we did for effectiveness of jury management, and that's to take a look at the jury fees for each juror, that total dollar amount, add the other juror expense, which is their mileage reimbursement, and divide that by the number of jury trials. So in my time, in my court, we were one of the most efficient courts if you look at just that measurement. But that doesn't tell the whole story of whether a court's effective and efficient use of its tax dollars regarding jury trials, because there's so many other factors at play. There's so many other measurements that could be taken into account. Thank goodness the National Center for State Courts did come along with the jury manager's toolbox that really provided a more comprehensive snapshot of that. And to my amazement, even though this made my court look good, this was used by the county officials, not by the court. They just saw this. They got the same statistical report that I had, and yet they ran with it. And they didn't even ask me. They ran with it, and they said, we're going to promote our court to the news media. The news media picked it up, didn't question it, didn't call me, and just said, and so when I went to our president judge and said, this is really not accurate. And he said, Richard, run with it. It's good news. I said, okay.
Kent Pankey?
Well, we've certainly seen many different distortion, of tales that take things out of proper context in the criminal justice sense, often by people that are pushing tough on crime policies that aren't backed up by the data. But I'll reach more back to my early career when I was at the National Center, when tort reform was a big push by a lot of corporations and conservative politicians. And they would cite a few cases, like the infamous McDonald's coffee case, and a few others that are cited in the Stella Awards, which were really fabrications that didn't happen in the first place, to try to justify policies that weren't backed up. Even if these cases had been as bad as they were portrayed, they were one or two cases out of millions, and did not in any matter, justify the types of policies that they had restricting people's ability to receive just compensation. And yet the politicians that were pushing this ultimately won in most states. So that's basically an anecdote that really killed a lot of good policy.
Do you find that you're less skeptical about statistics that support opinions you already have on a topic? Is it something that we should guard against? And how do we do that? Liz?
I want to say, yes, of course, I am less skeptical of statistics that support my position, because it's human nature to seek out information that corroborates your story. I mean, that's just how it is. And so for me, it really depends on what the statistics are about. I deal mostly in statistics about the operation of my court or the operation of courts in Oregon. And so I got a lot of years of experience at this point. I should be able to come up with a reasonable theory about what the statistics will show on almost any given thing. And so I have to also trust that gut. And so if the statistics don't corroborate what I'm thinking, I'm going to dig in at this point, but also I think we shouldn't just take everything without question. Like we were saying at the beginning, know what the numbers you're being presented are based on, and understand the basic principles of statistics and logic so that you can insert your brain when you need to question what you're being presented.
Cheryl Stone?
I agree with Liz. The longer that you do this work, the more intuitive it kind of becomes, especially if you've been at a court location for a long period of time and you understand the processes and procedures in detail. I think that informs some of the data that you're seeing. I think you have to be intentional, though, about trying to be objective, even though it's likely not possible to be completely objective, as Liz mentioned. But I try to dig into data, ask a lot of questions. Someone else pulls the data, and then I'm using it for analysis. And so I really try to make sure that I'm understanding what I'm seeing, the question in the query that pulled the data. And sometimes I'll make a decision not to use data or that particular data piece because it can be misleading or out of context, or it doesn't support how I thought it would come out. And we may want to look at it from a different angle. Maybe it tells a different story than what we thought. So I think it's good to be skeptical, to verify and check. And the more people in the courtroom can sometimes view data a lot differently than people in the administrative office. And so it's good to get that check and balance in there to make sure that the data is intuitive and can be explained in some way.
What was the term? Trust but verify?
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Should we be skeptical of statistical data and research that we see? And if so, how do we act on that skepticism? Liz?
So I think it really depends on the situation you're in. So, in Oregon, if one of my colleagues from another court were to present some statistical information, I might ask informed questions about how they arrived at that number and, what they think it was based on. I don't think we should go, mm-hmm. that's wrong. You have to be collegial, both in your location and nationally in terms of presenting contrary arguments. But I think you should do it when it's important. It really depends on the situation. You can act on it by seeking further information from the person presenting the thing that you're skeptical about, I think. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it turns out that you're skeptical in error. Mm-hmm. Their story is actually right. So that's good too.
Yeah. Kent?
I think an inherent skepticism is always wise, but you have to do as Liz suggests and think of context as to whether it's important to really get worked up about a particular set of statistics, and also think about, if it is important, how are you going to address that? Is that something you deal with privately, or is that something you need to do publicly because the bad data has already been presented to an audience, and before an important decision can be made, something has to be interjected?
Do you share any additional information that you find with court professionals in other courts?
We certainly would try to come up with good data sets. That's certainly the case when a particular jurisdiction wants to ask for another judge or more staff. We're going to look at those numbers and we're going to say, it doesn't look like they're filing particular cases in the correct way, and that's distorting their numbers. Or, we may say that actually their numbers are good, and that was contrary to what might have been expected. But yes, we look into those things, and as I said, if the context is right, we'll say something, and other times we let it go because it's not sufficiently important.
Cheryl?
I think a healthy skepticism is good. I mean, it helps in understanding what you're looking at. Data can be so different. For example, in Oregon is a unified court system, and so they may have more commonality in how they code things into the system, how they can report things out, whereas Washington is not a unified court system. We don't all use the same case management system. We don't all input in the same way. And so I think and that would be true nationally, right? We all have different ways of counting beans in our jurisdictions. So while our work is common, how we gather data can be very different. And our processes and procedures can be very different. So I think it's good to take all of that into context with any kind of statistical data and research that you're looking at from county to county or from state to state.
If we discover additional information regarding some research, either good or bad, do we have an obligation to share it with our fellow NACM members? And if so, how do we do that? Cheryl?
I think it depends. It depends on the impact of the difference. I think you would want to get together with the person who originally presented data and really have a collegial conversation about that. And then if it's a large deal, I suppose you would want to follow up that with perhaps some communication. I don't know. It would just depend on the situation, what that would look like. But again, I think that the context of information that we present can be so different from court to court, and so, or from state to state. So what I might find in my state might be very different than what you would find in New Jersey. And so I think there needs to be some room for that in our interpretation of statistics and research.
Greg?
Yeah, I mean, I largely agree. It depends who it's affecting, who's digesting information. You said NACM members, so if it's something of national importance and it really could sway our argument or debate or what have you on a particular topic, I think we have an obligation to make sure things are right. I think, as Liz said, you have to do it in a collegial fashion and as professionally as possible. But I think, especially if it's really coloring our debate, we've got to say, tell people what we feel is the right way of looking at this data. I also want to make a little point that I'm kind of coming to my head as I listen to you guys talk. And, government data, by and large, is actually pretty good. It's not like, it's usually done on a longitudinal basis. It's done over and over again. Mistakes are made everywhere. I'm not saying they aren't, but again, pretty reliable. But the problem becomes, especially, I don't know if you ever trolled through, say, census data, there's so much of it, and it's presented in so many variant ways that you really, really need to spend some time to understand what the chart you're looking at says to you, because you can go galloping off what the census data says and be so far off just because you were looking at the wrong table. So, it's a kind of a conundrum, because you have to respect the data because it is good data, but then you have to also really understand it. And I think sometimes the instance you were talking about could be someone just looking at something and misinterpreting what's going on, and they're stepping in and providing a more accurate analysis, without worrying about the whatever underlying issues at bay here is probably the right thing to do, because it's just kind of making sure people get things straight.
So what advice do you have for those tuning into today's episode? Greg?
Kind of end where I began, which is, if you don't have a good background in stats and research, dig in, learn about some of this stuff. You don't have to be a professor at it, but if you don't know what I mean by inferential statistics, maybe you need to know that. Just take a little time with it, and then when you've done that, apply it. And you start to get comfortable with this stuff. Look at what is being presented and look at the footnotes and see what they did. Oh, you surveyed 10 people. That's great. That's not statistics. It's a story.
Yeah.
So, do what you can to read about it, and then remember it as you go through it. And that's learn what's possible and what's not possible when it comes to stat analysis. Because sometimes, again, we just try to go too far, too fast with too little, and you don't want to do that.
Liz?
Well, since Greg stole my answer, I'm out of luck. But I will add this, especially for early court professionals. I think Greg should teach us all a statistics course at one of these conferences. So I'll be going to that.
Okay.
And then I would add, if you have an opportunity, take a logic class. Understand when people are giving you an argument, whether it's a good quality argument or not. And then you can also apply that to the numbers that are presented to you as well, not just statistical basis, but the logical basis for what you're trying to answer. And that's just really if you have an opportunity to do those things. And for the rest of us, we just need to remember to dig into the numbers, to ask questions, and to, as Cheryl mentioned, be skeptical.
Rick?
Peter, I'm always asked like third or fourth or fifth in line with these questions. So the best answers are already given by the time you get to me. So I will say I have to echo what Greg and Liz have just stated. And the only thing I can say is for particularly if you're a new court administrator or new to the profession, many of us, I know I'm one of them, who is not analytical, but you do have to be a data analyst as part of this job. And so get uncomfortable, as Greg and Liz just stated, and learn take a logic course, yes, and see why things are collected, or not only that, what they're measuring and why. And I think that will go a long way as to educating you and becoming, whether it's not necessarily more cynical, but just more well-rounded and understood about what we're actually looking at when it comes to data.
Mm-hmm. Kent?
I think we have responsibilities as court leaders to be both better consumers and presenters of court data, statistical data. And that means, as we've said, try to educate ourselves in appropriate ways, look at the core competencies, accountability, core performance, executive decision making, things of that nature if you're not going to go to the level of a college course.
Cheryl?
I would say do your research, make sure you understand the data, make sure that it is, that you've verified it, both from kind of a business process perspective, but also verified the data. Make sure you have a large enough sample size to see a trend, and know and understand the context behind the data if you're going to be presenting it.
I want to thank Rick Pierce, Cheryl Stone, Greg Lambard, Kent Pankey, and Liz Rambo for sharing with us their advice on questioning statistics in this era of misinformation and spin. It goes without saying that we all need to hone this skill on a regular basis. As always, my thanks to you court professionals tuning into today's episode. Your savvy sophistication while looking at statistical research is a valuable leadership ability. Thank you for all you do. Join us on Tuesday, October 17th, for another episode dealing with the issues facing our courts. This has been the Court Leaders Advantage podcast series. I'm Pete Kiefer, and thanks for joining us today. Thanks for joining us today. The Court Leaders Advantage is a regular podcast on courts and court administration. Today's episode will be available on our website, on YouTube, on Facebook, on iTunes, on LinkedIn, and on Twitter. Become part of the conversation. If you have questions, comments, or ideas for future episodes, email us. Our address is CLApodcast, that's all one word, @nacomnet.org. Did you hear an interesting comment by one of the panelists that you would like to listen to again, but you don't want to search through the entire episode to find it? The Additional Resources section of the webpage contains a question time marker sheet. Just find the discussion question on the sheet, and next to it is the time that question was asked. You can then quickly fast forward to that time in the episode and listen to the panelists' comments. Remember, if you don't have time to watch an episode, you can always listen to the audio version. Listen in your car or on the bus on your way to or from work. You never have to miss an episode. I'm Pete Kiefer, and on behalf of our guests, the Court Leader website, and the National Association for Court Management, thank you, and have a great day. The views, information, and opinions expressed during this episode are solely those of the host and the individual presenters. They do not necessarily represent the position of the National Association for Court Management.